Let's take a look at management by walking around. As a leader, you help people, and management by walking around is one way to do so. Physically walking around actually helps in the development of creative ideas. We also remember that we see better than what we hear. Management by walking around has three major activities: listening, teaching, and facilitating. By listening, you find out what's getting in the way or slowing employees down. By teaching, you coach to improve, and by facilitating, you remove the stumbling blocks preventing employees from improving performance. Feedback is critical to success.
As absurd as it sounds, I can almost say that I had a day back in 1978 that was the most significant day of my professional life. I worked for McKinsey and Company, a big consulting firm. I worked in San Francisco, and my colleague Bob Waterman and I were looking at companies that did things well. And typically, because of the nature of the company we worked for, we worked with these giant, big bureaucratic companies like Chase Manhattan Bank and Citicorp and Bank of America and so on. And so we went 25 miles down the road from San Francisco to what was then the reasonably small town of Palo Alto to visit a reasonably small but interesting company called Hewlett Packard. We met the president, a guy by the name of John Young, and as John told us these fascinating stories, he also revealed one of the quote unquote Hewlett Packard secrets, which was something that they called MBWA, or managing by wandering around. And Bob and I had spent our professional careers with CEOs who sat behind layer after layer of secretaries and people who didn't get out of their office from one week to the next. And we were just enchanted by it. And, what is it, 77 to, now it's over 30 years later, and I'm even more in love with the term. And in love with the term is the term, MBWA, managing by wandering around. But what I really am in love with it as is more or less a metaphor for being in touch, a metaphor for not losing touch with your employees, your vendors, your customers, or what have you. And so I'm trying simply to sell you the term MBWA, and I'm also trying to sell you the discipline of, in fact, getting out of your office and getting close to where the work is really done and working like hell to make sure the normal course of affairs does not keep you from doing that.
Let's take a look at management by walking around. Management by walking around is an organizational principle made famous in the 1980s. Years of research indicate that effective management practices are not built around management by walking around. But the idea of requiring managers at all levels of the organization to wander around their departments to observe, converse, and hear from employees continues to be a common business practice. While management by walking around sounds helpful, its limitations suggest that modern practices focusing on building trust and relationships are more effective for management. Limitations include available hours, focus, and application. Managers are charged with planning, organizing, coordinating, and controlling. Yet even CEOs report spending 53% of their average 55-hour work week in time wasting meetings. Management by walking around turns management focus towards the concerns of employees. This is good, but only to a degree. High level leaders also need to be thinking strategically, proactively, and longer term. The principle behind management by walking around is that more managers know their employees, the more effective those managers will be as a result. This is not always true. We need objective data to make the most effective management decisions. Based on the need for managers to dedicate their efforts to administering and growing the business, and given the proven effectiveness of objective performance measures, it seems the time for management by walking around is gone. Yet there still is one caveat: managers should know their employees well.
I think the challenge is learning requires pretty putting yourself in new positions to observe. I'll give one example. I think Tom Peters did some great work with Bob Waterman with managing by wandering around. So they looked at Hewlett Packard, and I love behind thought leadership. Hewlett Packard had a headquarters near where Peters lived in Stanford. And so he went to Hewlett Packard. They did managing by wandering around. Well, guess what? You can't do that in a remote workforce. In fact, if you were trying to do managing by wandering around, we're going to turn our camera on your house every, random to see what you're doing. Now, that's an invasion of all privacy. So what do you do? What do you do? I've been struggling with that. I think that's a great question. And so I love thought leadership where you say, managing by wandering around doesn't work. So what do you do to build informal relationships? I started calling it management by checking in. So one leader I talked to, best practice, she calls her employees once a week for 10 minutes, and it's prohibited to talk about work. How are you doing? What's your hobby? When you get on the phone with someone, the first question is not what's going on with work, it's what's going on in your life. What's a good news moment? And you check in, and you formally check in to manage the informal relationship. That's an example. Management by wandering around, great idea. Nobody would disagree with that idea. But it doesn't work today in the way that it may have worked under another time. So how do you think about what's next? That's what I love to do.